Mirko Bagaric and Julie Clarke present a limited justification for the use of torture. They begin by acknowledging there is a broad prohibition against torture, and they give a brief definition that torture is the infliction of severe pain and suffering, and it is generally used as an interrogation device or as punishment. They are not going to defend its use as punishment, of course. Bagaric and Clarke acknowledge that torture is nearly universally deplored, and there are international prohibitions, both by explicit agreements and treaties, as well as Jus Cogens law. Jus Cogens law is a compelling law or higher law that is binding on a country, whether or not it was explicitly accepted by that country. So this is a theoretical law that is supposed to be obviously something that needs to be followed for any civilized country to function in the world at large. And of course, there are many clear prohibitions of torture. For example, the UN Convention Against Torture, so the United Nations has explicit prohibitions of torture. So not only is it something that is prohibited just by reflection on what a nation needs to be doing in order to be part of an international community, it is explicitly prohibited by the United Nations. However, that doesn't prevent it from being used. And Bagaric and Clarke estimate that, they cite an investigation that estimates that torture has been used in more than 150 countries. And of course, mostly these countries are denying that they use it, but some forms seem to have been used broadly throughout the world. And despite its universal condemnation, torture has been used by the United States, according to Bagaric and Clarke. For example, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, also known as KSM, was waterboarded by the United States. He was sensory deprived, and both of those things are often considered to be examples of torture. Now, it's been debated whether or not the information received from KSM was useful in finding Osama bin Laden. Many people argue it was. Some people argue it was not. And of course, whether or not waterboarding is actually torture is something that is debated as well. But once waterboarding has been made public, the United States has since discontinued its use. It is no longer legal to use in the United States. However, some prominent people, including an attorney, Alan Dershowitz, argues that torture should be legal, and then it would be regulated, and we would have trained people who would use it. Bagaric and Clarke argue that torture is sometimes morally defensible. So it is morally defensible when more grave harm can be avoided by using it for interrogation. Again, it's not going to be defensible as a form of punishment. The idea here is it's defensible when there is significant harm that could be avoided. It's never defensible as a method of punishment. And they cite a case where a terrorist network may have placed a bomb on a large commercial jet somewhere over the United States. They post a video on YouTube announcing this. Of course, they don't reveal which plane has the bomb, but the leader of the networks has been under surveillance and is immediately captured and refuses to give the authorities any details about the bomb. That's a kind of situation where Bagaric and Clarke say torture would be justified. They also say that this is not some fantastic hypothetical case, this is the kind of thing, unfortunately, that does happen in the world. So it is useful to consider what we ought to do in this kind of situation. So they provide some, admittedly vague here for a moment, justification for using torture. They say the interest of the one individual needs to be sacrificed for the sake of other people. So it is a utilitarian argument, but in this case, unlike our arguments that we use to provide counterexamples for utilitarian theory, the individual in question who is having his rights or his preferences and goals in life sacrificed, this individual is not an innocent person. They are guilty. And Bagaric and Clarke also argue that torture can be justified on deontological grounds. So the idea there is, if you were on that plane, imagine, that had a bomb on it that was going to go off, and somebody else had the opportunity to torture an individual so that the bomb could be found and it could be stopped, you would want that to happen. And you might be willing to say, let it be a universal law that if somebody is going to put a bomb on a plane or some other kind of mass catastrophe, that they should be tortured to get information to stop it. Now, they do clarify that they say it's only permissible in order to prevent severe harm, and that has to be loss of life to others, and typically that's going to be plural. A question that might come up is torture effective? Now, as a practical matter, they note that torture can be effective in gaining information, and they cite a case in Germany where there was a kidnapping, and one of the perpetrators was caught. Of course, he refused to tell where the boy that was kidnapped was, and after many attempts to get the information failed. The local person authorized the use of torture, and the perpetrator quickly gave up the authorities the directions to the boy's location. In that specific case, unfortunately, the boy had already been killed. But the location was identified through the use of torture, and Bagaric and Clarke cite this as an example of using torture to be effective in gaining the information that one desires. Now, how should we evaluate whether or not to use torture? Bagaric and Clarke provide 5 variables that are relevant for determining whether torture is justified and to what degree. So we have this basic utilitarian argument. They've also said that even on a deontological theory, you could justify torture. So how does it work if we're considering a utilitarian approach? What factors need to be considered? First of all, the number of lives at risk, and this obviously fits in with utilitarian theory, the extent of the harm that might be caused. Second would be the immediacy of the harm. If the harm is farther into the future, then there's no need to use torture to get information. We should be using other means to get it. And that brings us to the third point. Are there other means that we could use to acquire the information? Has there been surveillance? Has there been some other way of getting the information that we need that could be obtained without the use of torture? A fourth factor is the level of wrongdoing of the agent. They said that torture should be used only in those cases where the person being tortured is part of the problem, right? They are a perpetrator in question. And finally, the likelihood that the agent actually knows the relevant information. So if you have someone who's been captured and this person is not higher up in the organization, it's possible that they don't know, for example, the location of the bomb, which plane it might be on. And so that needs to be taken into consideration. So these are factors that need to be considered on whether or not torture would be justified. They do say that there are certainly limitations on the use of torture because it is such a violation of the integrity of the person, not only physically but psychologically. And so it's only justified when a life or many lives are endangered. Typically, that's going to be many lives. And as we've seen with those factors that we're considering, it should only be used as a last resort. That's why the immediacy of the harm and the potential to use other means to get the information has to be considered. That's why those factors are there. Torture should only be used against those who are very likely to have the relevant information. So again, that's going to be one of the factors. So this is kind of summarizing how the factors are relevant in limiting the use of torture. And they provide a formula to use where we take those 5 factors and we put them in a formula. We put the ones that give motivation to use torture on top. The W is whether the agent is the wrongdoer. So that's a factor that you would put on the top part of the formula. The numerator, we use the number of lives at risk in the numerator. So the higher that is, the more justification one has for using torture. We use the probability that the agent has the relevant knowledge. The higher that is, the more plausible, the more justification we have to use torture. Now on the denominator, the things that would reduce our justification for using torture would be the time available before the disaster will occur. So if it's long, then this formula is going to reveal a lower number. And finally, the O represents the likelihood that other inquiries would be successful. So if that's to a high degree, then that should reduce the justification of using torture. So this is a general formula that they've come up with that we could use, and you plug in numbers. And presumably things like number of lives at risk, that's going to be an obvious number. You count up the number of people, 100, 500, 5 million, whatever it might be. The probability that the agent has relevant knowledge, that's going to be a number between 0 and 1. That's how we measure probability. Whether the agent's the wrongdoer, I presume that would just be a 1 or a 0. There may be some levels of probability in terms of whether or not we are confident that the agent is the wrongdoer. So that's how these things work. Now, a question that I would have immediately regarding this formula is it would be odd that you're using addition on the numerator here. Otherwise, as I just suggested, your W and your P are not going to add up to more than 2 together. So the number of lives at risk, if there are 100 lives at risk, say, and W and P add up to 2, well, that just increases your justification from 100 to 102 in the numerator. And that's not really going to move the degree of justification much at all. And so my suggestion is that we should probably be using multiplication there, not addition on that upper part of the formula. Otherwise, you know, the W and the P become basically irrelevant. It's going to be the L that matters, and we don't really need to take into consideration W and P, but obviously they want us to do that. Now, what kind of number is it that we're looking for to justify torture? Well, that number is not provided. Instead, this is intended to be a broad guideline, and they suggest, you know, leave it for other people to fill in the details here. But in any case, torture is permissible when the formula yields a number above a threshold that they don't identify here. So maybe the threshold is going to be, you know, a certain number, 500, once you specify the units of time and so on, the degrees of probability, and make sure that you're clear on how you're going to measure these things. And the degree of torture is then also related to the result. So maybe waterboarding would be used if it's above the threshold, but some people don't consider that torture, for example. So maybe you wouldn't use a more intense type of torture unless it was above a higher level. Now, they're not trying to specify details here in this formula. Their aim is to make the larger case that torture is sometimes morally permissible, and to just suggest here's how we might evaluate using it and provide some limitations on its use so that it wouldn't be abused. Now, finally, they argue that regulation is much better than prohibition. For one, they say it's already being used, and another, it defines the limits that one would have to follow. The formula gives you guidelines so that it's not going to be used when this formula gives you a number that is too low to justify its use. And they say, given that it's already in fact practiced, we need something like this in place. Now, Bagaric and Clarke consider some possible opposing concerns. So one counter-argument is that this will open the door for abuse, and there's a slippery slope toward more and more use of torture. Once you start saying we are going to allow torture, it might provide the opportunity for abuse. A second concern is that it's going to lead to a broad acceptance of the idea that the end justifies the means. Now, Bagaric and Clarke respond with three different points here. One, they say, of course, torture is already used. So the idea that it's going to open the door for abuse, that's kind of irrelevant since we've already taken that move. Second response here is that lawful uses are no more likely to be abused than things like the death penalty, for example. Other significant, harmful to individuals types of punishments or things that are sanctioned by law are restricted by law, and so they say as long as we have those guidelines in place, it's not any more likely to be abused than other things that we in fact are involved in. And finally, to the concern that it might lead to a broad acceptance of the idea that the end justifies the means, Bagaric and Clarke's response to that is very simple. Sometimes the end does justify the means. So that is their view on the use of torture and their response to some concerns. Now, I close with a question to consider here. Bagaric and Clarke don't explicitly appeal to this, but I wonder if somebody who wanted to justify the use of torture might use some principles related to self-defense. So, for example, our principles of self-defense allow us to use certain degrees of responses to harm an attacker in order to prevent severe harm to oneself. Would they not also extend to, say, for example, one's child? If somebody broke into a home and was causing harm to one of your children, it seems that you would be justified in using what might be considered self-defense in order to prevent further harm. Or the same seems to apply to your spouse. And wouldn't it also apply to a friend? And how about a fellow citizen that might be being attacked? And if you came to that person's rescue, say a fellow citizen was being beaten and robbed, wouldn't it be plausible to use the same degree of force to prevent harm to the citizen? And, you know, to what extent might this provide a plausible justification for the use of torture? Now, none of these things are things that Bagaric and Clarke have to use. They've provided their formula, And certainly one might say that this principles of self-defense are very localized and they're very specific to one individual. And when we're talking about using torture, we're typically talking about several individuals, and it seems to be a different kind of situation. So whether or not it applies, I leave that as a question to consider.